Welcome to the Police Free Campus podcast. I'm your host, Charles H.F. Davis III, and we are thankful to be joined in conversation today by comrades and colleagues working to reimagine post-secondary institutions and a world without police. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Kamaria Porter, an assistant professor of education at Pennsylvania State University. Informed by her experience as a counselor in sexual assault prevention and support programs, Kamaria's research focuses on issues of campus sexual assault and campus sexual violence, paying particular attention to the many and varied barriers of incident reporting for Black women and non-binary students. We're also joined by Dr. Jessica Harris, Associate Professor of Higher Education at the University of California, Los Angeles. Jessica's work has broadly engaged issues of race and racism in higher education to include their intersection with campus sexual violence and the experiences of women of color student survivors. She has been the recipient of the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship, as well as being recognized by the Association for the Study of Higher Education as a 2020 Early Career Award recipient. Comrades, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm super excited for this conversation today. I actually think it's probably one of the most important conversations that we'll have in the podcast series, in so much as the public discourse often is wrestling with this idea of police and prison abolition. And inevitably, right, this sort of silver bullet to thwart any good faith engagement with the idea is the question, what about sexual violence, right, and those who perpetrate sexual violence? And so what I'm hoping that we'll be able to understand in large part is thinking about this concern, which to me sort of is built in these common misunderstandings of, one, the breadth of sexual assault and sexual violence experienced on campus, two, who is differently and perhaps most vulnerable to sexual assault and violence on campus, three, what constitutes justice and pathways for healing for victims and survivors, and four, the role or lack thereof of police and their deputies in addressing issues of sexual violence. And so in thinking about those as points of departure, Jessica, I'd like to start with you in helping us kind of understand the broader scope of campus sexual violence and the ways in which this has been a longstanding, perhaps even everyday phenomenon for women on college and university campuses.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. First off, I'm really excited to be here and be in conversation. So the breadth is large. It's also, there's a lot of depth to it too. It's also pretty deep. I always like to start with, or maybe remind people, that the majority of US colleges, the campuses reside on Indigenous land, and that land was taken through violence, through the raping, through the murder of Indigenous bodies, of Indigenous culture. And so, I mean, that's the depth right there, right? Like, and the breadth. But it's really that we're residing on the product of sexual violence, of violence in general. I live on campus, I'm a faculty in residence. And so as I sit here speaking to you, I have to think about and acknowledge that I'm also in some way playing into that system. And one of the ways that I can disrupt that is to talk about that in class, or talk about in the syllabus, beyond just a land acknowledgement of like, this is the original land of, or the caretakers of. It's more so of like, this land was taken from violently, ruthlessly, from Indigenous individuals. And we're continuing to operate on that land today and on that violence today. So that's, I think, the breadth of sexual violence on the college campus. You know, you hear the 1 in 4 statistic. Oftentimes 1 in 4 women on the college campus will experience sexual violence. I think that statistic is may cover the breadth, not even, because for certain identities, for certain students with certain identities, that statistic is going to be 1 in 7, 1 in 1, right? Like 1 in 2, more likely. But that statistic doesn't really matter. I think that it's more about the depth and less about the breadth. Any individual, any person that experiences sexual violence on the college campus, we should be concerned about that. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you for that. Kamaria, anything that you might add as well? I really appreciated, Jessica, you sort of situated us historically, and I don't think that often happens, right? Like, we don't think of this as a phenomenon that even predates and is at the genesis of these institutions. But yeah, Kamaria, other thoughts here?
Yes, thank you, Jessica, for that context. And speaking from my institutional positionality, Pennsylvania State University was a land grant institution. What we now know, thanks to the reporting by High County News, a land grab institution, where the methods of genocide sexual violence and theft were carried out against over 150 tribes across mostly the Western United States to form the endowment that created the Pennsylvania State University. So that's another aspect that I like to bring to bear. While our land acknowledgement acknowledges the physical land, the wealth that was taken is far broader than just the land we sit on. And how federal policy facilitated that theft. And so the connections between federal policy and sexual violence on campuses, that is the core of my work as well. So looking forward to digging into that.
Yeah, so to pick up on that, I mean, as someone who's both studied and also served in the practitioner role in support of survivors, when we're thinking about this sort of long historical landscape and the various data points, right, that we could talk about, that in some ways like reduces the phenomenon itself to not being a thing that's deeply impersonal in terms of people's experiences. How would you kind of relate that to like the on the ground experiences of just, navigating that with survivors, and in terms of how depersonal sometimes these data points can get with things that affect people really throughout the entirety of their lives?
Wait, can you repeat the question? We can edit this out.
Yeah, we got it all in post.
Okay.
So just thinking about the breadth and the depth, right, of the landscape of sexual violence, I think often that becomes something that's either depersonalized or not seen to be also the thing that affects actual people. And I'm wondering how your experience, both studying and sort of being on the ground in support capacities, can help us like humanize our understanding of what the implications of these phenomena are.
Yeah, definitely. I'll start from an intellectual academic perspective. In sociology, there's a concept called rape exceptionalism, where in both we think about sexual violence as the most horrible thing that can happen to someone. There is this, horror, shock, disgust that it has elicited. But at the same time, we cannot fathom that actually happening to someone, and that someone, particularly someone we know or admire, even like through a parasocial relationship, whether a historical figure or a celebrity, committing such a horrible act. And so from that perspective, it kind of makes sense how we can have this prevalence, 1 in 4 on a college campus, and lifetime statistics of gender-based violence with women, but also this lack of response, lack of empathy, lack of centering the survivor through that lens. From my work with survivors and my research, think the individual experiences of violence can be incredibly isolating, despite knowing that it happens to so many people, because it is extremely personal. It's often people and have some reason to trust. It's often in spaces where you go to find community, particularly for Black women on college campuses. The parties, the social events, that going to a friend's house, and there's this sense of intercultural trust, which Jennifer Gomez writes a lot on, that is broken when sexual violence happens. And so that can be incredibly isolating, though we know there is this large scope.
Yeah, Jessica, jump on in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that. And the way that you posed the question, Charles, made me think of, how dehumanizing sexual violence is, right? And I think it reminds me, I use critical race theory to frame a lot of my work around sexual violence, specifically intersectionality, but also the larger framework. And it reminds me so much of how the dehumanization of an individual through sexual violence is really about power and like disempowering that person, further disempowering rather. And then the power that brings or gives to the perpetrator, especially when that perpetrator is not sanctioned or not brought to justice. then I was thinking, so I was like, oh, okay, well, sexual violence is really about dehumanization. But then you expect these institutions that are also rather dehumanizing, right? I think that institutions of a higher education base level at this point are very dehumanizing, even more dehumanizing for specific students with specific identities, women of color, trans individuals, trans people of color. And so I just think, I think the question was like, how do you humanize it? And I think it's not the first step, but we need to humanize our institutions, and we need to acknowledge that sexual violence is about power, and that institutions are about power, and that we need to acknowledge in some way power in the healing process and or in the reporting process and in the actual act of sexual violence. So how do we humanize it is like the answer to like, how do we eradicate sexual violence? So I don't think either of us have that answer. That's why we're doing the work we do. But I think that it is always about these larger, people are feeling dehumanized or not human because of course these institutions are not humanizing them. And again, to go back to history, like because they were built on the dehumanization of an entire culture, of an entire people, right? And we still don't acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And so much as when we think about, sort of the work in campus climate, we'll say in general, and we talk about sort of these historical legacies, often sexual and gender-based violence isn't a part of that conversation, right? Which, of course, as you both know and teach us, intersectionality becomes critically important for us to understand how those things are interrelated and overlap and intersect. And as I'm thinking about that humanization piece, one of the things that strikes me to a certain extent, right, is this also longer historical narrative that I'm wondering if you can talk about in terms of your own work and other scholars with whom you're familiar, that the unique experiences of women of color and trans and non-binary folks related to sexual violence kind of push against and interrogate the way that we're socialized to understand these things, particularly in relationship to the idea of like white femininity, right? And that being something worthy of protection and perhaps even retribution, and how long that history sort of is, both in recognizing that white women under patriarchy also don't, right, receive justice when it comes to these types of things, but even more so that we understand what that means for women of color and whether we even designate them to be human in the first place, that even if a thing were to happen, right, how that affects things like reporting. So I wonder if you can kind of talk about that juxtaposition, right, that sort of like racial within group difference when it comes to gender-based and sexual violence as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, historically, we know that some of the first survivors and anti-rape movements in history were led by Black women. Sexual citizenship, meaning full bodily autonomy, full protection of one's body autonomy and recognition of it under the law, has been the freedom project for Black women since time immemorial. And so our freedom struggle is deeply intertwined with eradicating gender-based violence and disrupting carceral systems that are anti-Black. And Black women have been able to hold these two things in their minds simultaneously, to advocate for Black men in the criminal legal system, and then to fight for their own protection, whether that's from violence from the state, violence from racism, and racial terror for Black women took the form of rampant sexual violence, and then violence from within communities where Black women are experiencing gender-based violence intra-racially, but also have the burden of keeping silent to protect the community, because that is the role that white supremacy puts us in. So in the face of the law, Black women, and by extension, women of color, are completely unprotected. Also, scholars, drawing from Danielle McGuire and Estelle Friedman, have really done the work of conceptualizing rape and sexual violence as a tool of power through research on Black women's experiences. So the work that I do around campus sexual assault, though it may seem very like narrow or marginal in the field, it is a core question of these campuses are unsafe, and marginalized students, particularly Black women, are unprotected on these campuses. And that has implications for all the things that we care about as higher ed researchers: sense of belonging, retention, academic and student success. So, you know, as Black women's sexual citizenship has been the Freedom Project, I believe that confronting sexual violence is the inclusion project of higher ed, and it should be more central.
Yeah, Jessica, anything you'd like to add there?
No, I think that Kamaria said a lot and captured a lot. The one thing I would add is just about intergenerational trauma. And I think that that really plays into gender-based violence, sexual violence on the college campus for women of color. Yeah, I find it a lot in my research where women will say, you know, I'm actually writing something right now where I'm sitting with this chapter that is really talking about how a few women in my study, women of color, were saying, you know, I expected to experience sexual violence in college because my mother did, and my grandmother did, and my great grandmother did, perhaps not in college, but in these other arenas. And so I carry that with me, and I expected that to happen. I knew that I was really vulnerable getting here. And so that's something that I think we need to start paying attention to, is intergenerational trauma. But also, you know, putting that into our prevention programs, right? That it's not just about, okay, 30 minutes of, you know, 15 minutes is Title IX, 15 minutes is the Sexual Violence Resource Center, and good, you're ready to go as first year students. No, like we need to be talking about intergenerational trauma, and that being a precursor. It's always, okay, well, if you've experienced sexual violence before coming into college, that's a precursor or a risk factor. Or if you're a heavy drinker, that's a risk factor. And it's looking at these larger intersectional, or rather intersecting aspects of an individual's background to say, okay, because your grandmother fled the Vietnam War or X, Y, and Z, that's predisposing you to this experience or to trauma. So I think that's, you know, we really need to like start thinking outside of the box, because to be very, I will own it, I have never been a practitioner when it comes to work and resources and healing around sexual violence. And so that is, you know, a deficit of mine. And so I'm cautious in saying this, but we really need to start thinking outside of the box when it comes to prevention education, to healing. And I actually think that practitioners are, again, it goes back to the institution continually not allowing for the humanization of individuals. So when a practitioner comes to them and says, hey, I read this thing, or I saw this thing about yoga as a form of healing for survivors, especially for women of color, you know, the institution might say, like, we can't give you resources for that, or that seems way too outside of what of the arena that we want to dabble in. So that was my quick thing to add to what Kamaria said.
Yeah, so I really appreciate this sort of like outside of the box perspective, right? And so I want to be able to turn our attention a bit more explicitly to sort of the focus of the podcast as we're sort of dealing with these issues of policing, of prisons, of justice. But I want to take a short detour, one, in sort of saying out loud the thing that we all understand, but it needs to be acknowledged, right? When we think about even prevention education, right? Like who that's often geared towards. And as you were talking about, like these risk factors, right? We're not necessarily talking about their predisposition to commit acts of sexual violence, right? And knowing how responsible men have and consistently have been in that process, and all the ways that the culture around masculinity, around manhood, the things that reify those things that we know to be toxic are things that typically go unaddressed, right? In a variety of areas, fraternity, sorority life, athletics, any number of places. And so I'm also then thinking about the role and responsibility of men to take up this work, right, in really important ways, even irrespective of this idea of whether they see themselves as practitioners or interventionists, particularly in this moment where you have a lot of folks trying to kind of be frontline about, you know, their feminist politics or what that actually means, and yet sort of still being detached in some ways from this work. Some of whom we know also experience various acts of sexual violence, right, through their own histories and their own lives. But as we're thinking about that, one of the things that struck me in reading you all's work and the findings around survivors with whom you collaborated is that there wasn't like an explicit mention of police or like criminalization or like carceral forms of retribution when it came to what needed to be done in the aftermath and the healing and the restoration process. And I'm wondering if you are able to sort of speak to at least what you believe, why carceral solutions weren't more centered in the way that folks were responding in your studies, and how even that framework, and this is usually what institutions provide, right, is severely limiting to even how we understand or conceptualize the ideas of gender or sexual justice.
I will say I keep saying very briefly.
We're all academics here, we know.
I know, right? Briefly,
Never
5
brief.
minutes later, yeah. So this is actually really interesting. The reason why I'm like, oh, okay, brief, because I have an example or a thought where it wasn't recent, pandemic. So before the pandemic, I collected data at 4 different institutions with women of color who are survivors of sexual violence. I also talked to many of the Title IX coordinators, directors, advocates, so on and so forth. So within that study, I'm like going to these 3 large, very, whatever, public institutions. And I'm kind of finding the same thing. Women are saying, a lot of Black women are saying, I didn't report, or I don't want to go to the police because I do not trust that system, and or my perpetrator was a man of color or a Black man, and so I'm not going to throw my brother under the bus. So we're seeing that kind of across institutions. You are also actually at one institution, women were reporting to the police. And that was actually the first place that they went, but that's because they didn't really trust their institution. So because the institution was all about athletics and fraternity life and white men and whiteness. And so they were like, my only option is the police because they might maybe be the ones that will protect me. And those women also had a lot of witnesses and what they call evidence. But what I want to talk about a little bit is the final institution, which was the liberal arts institution, right? So we're going from like 20,000 students, 30,000 students, public institution, athletics, fraternity life, to this 1,800 person private liberal arts institution. And all of these women, a ton of them are reporting. They're reporting and they're saying, I actually don't want to report through the institutional process. I refuse to do that. I want to report and have restorative justice. I'm learning about restorative justice in my classes, in my critical race theory classes, my women's studies classes, in my core classes. And so I'm learning about this, and I want to use that to adjudicate this, or rather to discuss with this perpetrator how they have wronged me and to bring this situation to justice, to feel like I have justice. And so I think the answer to many things I believe in the world is education. But it's education in a way that we're not being educated, because we're not being educated to think outside of the box. So I don't think restorative justice is going to work for every individual or in every institution, but I do think that restorative justice process at that specific institution, because the institution was teaching their students about it and the power of it, and the students also felt very empowered on the campus, right? Like, I think that is the power or the beauty of a liberal arts institution. I went to one as an undergrad. But that you don't feel like you're just a number. You feel like you actually have a say in the community oftentimes. I think that the structural diversity of that institution also makes a difference, right? If there's more people of color, you might feel like you have more of this community and power to change your institution. And so I think that that's why we don't see women talking about this at other institutions, is because they're not being educated about it, because they don't feel like they have a voice or they don't have power. They continue to see the police as people that will kill them, will murder their brothers, will murder their fathers. And so I think it's about educating on like different ways that we can adjudicate, or that we can bring individuals and situations to justice.
Yeah. I will follow up. So there are multiple levels at which my work centers and critiques the carceral system, and particularly police. So police, and by extension campus police, are notoriously, and this is documented by evidence, bad at investigating sexual assault, believing victims of any identity profile, but particularly believing victims who are Black women or women of color. They deploy these gendered racist assumptions of Black women survivors that silence, blame, and harm them further. And knowing that keeps a lot of the Black women in my sample from doing that. They don't want to participate in the mobilization of anti-Blackness, both against themselves being blamed and invalidated, but also against other members in the community, including the assailant, but also Black men in their lives who want to step up and be the avengers. Because we know in the Black community, we can't count on systems. And this is a quote from one of our participants. We can't count on systems to do the right thing by us. And so we have to do it ourselves. But police in general are notoriously bad. In 2019, The Atlantic did an article on untested rape kits, and they estimated over 200,000 across the United States. And so that's 2019, pre-pandemic. You can't imagine things are getting better on that aspect of testing the rape kits. And secondly, a lot of the decisions about whether or not a report, we think like, oh, you report it, and it goes through all the motions. You think of like, oh, the Law and Order episode. You go to Olivia Benson, and then it goes to Sam Waterston, the state's attorney. That doesn't happen. There are a lot of interruptions, silencing, and processes that prevent survivors from even seeing a courtroom if they do report and there is evidence. These are unpopular cases. They're not cases people want to get involved with. And hardly anyone faces incarceration or punishment. The second thing is reporting to the police is incredibly dangerous. Bowling Green State University has a database of crimes committed by police officers. And I'm drawing from a 2018 CNN article that said they found over a 9-year period, there were documented, so this is just what is documented, 400 cases of forcible sexual assault committed by police on civilians. So, and that's just what's been reported. So when people are multiply marginalized, they're likely not coming forward with the incident they're experiencing. And so knowing all of that about police, law enforcement, and the legal system, you think about campus police, if they are trained in the same mode, how can they be any better? Is there opportunity to get a rape kit, a forensic rape exam on your campus? Will that be tested? Will that be handled properly? The same mechanisms that silence survivors who do try to come forward or participate in the criminal legal system are probably mirrored or exacerbated on a college campus where that's not our primary function. For my participants, I interviewed 46 Black women at PWIs and HBCUs, and actually I interviewed 13 of the participants that I talked to entered some kind of reporting process, whether that was through accidentally disclosing to a mandatory reporter or being having a thought for a moment that they might be believed, because to them it was cut and dry. They were asleep, especially in some of the cases that were reported. And either they faced this extreme hostility that they couldn't attribute. Is this the gender thing? Is it all women treated like this? Is it a race and gender thing because I'm a Black woman? Just like the total topsy-turviness of being someone who's been harmed, who's had a thorough exam where people are like, yeah, you have been injured, you have been hurt, and then facing this wall of disbelief and blaming. But I want to end this comment on one thing in my data that surprised me completely. A Black woman who is going to school in Michigan experienced sexual assault from a white assailant. She decided to report 2 weeks after, so it wasn't like right after, but she reported, and there was a middle-aged white cop who took her report. He was amenable to her having her advocate, her sexual assault advocate, in the room. He conducted a trauma-informed interview, including to the point where when it was time for her to talk about the incident, he left the room and her advocate wrote the narrative together. And so she never had to speak it. He told her that he thought she was a hero. He empathized with her, saying that he had experienced harm in his life. And he said that he was going to fight for her. And he did. That case went to the prosecutor. The assailant took a plea, and there were sanctions imposed. And I share that story not because we all have to hope for one good cop, but I share that story because that is also embedded in changing systems. Where this student reported is the same place where Rebecca Campbell, who is a researcher at Michigan State University, the national expert on the neurobiology of trauma, she works with and trains police departments on how to do trauma-informed interviewing. So whether or not this is one good cop, but it was one good cop in a geographical location where they received training on how to work with survivors in a trauma-informed way. So change is possible. And, just to tie this up with what Jessica said, it's through education, it's through that being intentional. So.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And so in thinking about what it is that you shared, especially that last point, right, of how sort of situated in particular, right, this instance is juxtaposed to like the mountains of evidence to the contrary. I think folks would sort of push back in so much as, and we saw this in a number of news stories, one of which you mentioned, but also Grace Watkins wrote a piece for the Chronicle a couple of years ago that talks about the crimes of campus police, that really focused on the ways that police are deeply a part of, not just in their professional capacity, but often in their personal lives, right? Perpetrators of sexual violence, and even more so, given their abilities to arrest, right, to sanction, to punish, even potentially kill. And we even have heard like popular stories around this, and by popular I mean those that are in like the general discourse, about ways that they've abused that position of power to take advantage of vulnerable women of color, girls of color, even in some instances. And so I wonder about how reasonable that possibility is, right? Like, because we know that we can like educate to the ends of the earth, right? We can train, we can try to address bias, so forth and so on, but yet people are still dying, they're still experiencing harm and violence. And so, what do we say to the tension that exists, right? Of like, here's where we're at present, right? Campus police are very much a part of the campus culture. They're the folks to whom many defer and conflate this idea of safety with what I believe to be, and many abolitionists would say as well, is the reality that police are doing more harm than they're doing good, right? And like dealing with that, because people often are going to ask for solutions. And that's kind of always a looming question, right? Like, well, what about X? And admittedly, we don't have all of them, but what does a pathway forward potentially look like in your mind? And this is kind of where we, for all of our guests, we want the time to invite them into this exercise of imagine, right? And sort of reimagining. And in thinking about that for us, abolition kind of serves as the starting point, and we draw a lot on Ruthie Gilmore's work, which kind of instructs us to think about abolition as the presence of life-affirming institutions rather than merely the absence of those things that expose us to the possibilities of premature death. And we know, of course, right, sexual violence is chief among them. So I'm wondering, when you all are sort of like imagining or reimagining higher education as a life-affirming institution, particularly for victims and survivors of sexual violence, what does that look like, right? And again, we don't have to have all the pragmatics, but if we were just imagining this, like, what does that look like in your mind as people who are deeply connected to and informed by what it is you've been learning with engaging with survivors?
Yeah, definitely. When I imagine, my imagine is prevention, is ending. And so one of the things that I found in my research was that Black women and non-binary students who had experienced sexual assault during college, they also had these other experiences on campus that made them feel either hyper visible because of their race and gender, or invisible. So unworthy, unseen in their role as a college student. And so when no one can see you as the thing that you are, a college student, then the things that happen to you don't matter. And so so in writing about that and reflecting on the narratives of participants, we need to at first confront gendered racist stereotypes and structures that limit the college prospects and goals of Black women in higher education, so that they're not feeling isolated, like a target's on their back when they're the one Black woman in the chemistry 101 lecture, but also not being overly sexualized in their daily ongoing activities. We also need spaces for Black women, non-binary, and trans students to gather that are separate from Black men and white people, where they can process, strategize, and support each other, form those protective factors within a community. And it has to be separate from the Greek system, because sororities and fraternities, particularly in Black Greek life, they're deeply interconnected, and there are lots of reasons why they should be. But this space needs to be separate from that, and it just for students who are marginalized by their race and their gender. On the other side, if a student is exposed to sexual assault, how can we protect their success in college after sexual assault exposure? And that is where we are severely failing. Adjudication, going through a hearing process or an investigation process, is not restorative in any way, even if in the cases that are in my data, going through the whole process and it ending in a suspension or a finding of responsibility of the perpetrator, that survivor still had to go through that process, still had to detract time when they should be studying or even seeking counseling to that process. And so we need protective, supportive measures for survivors to stay in school, because that is their Title IX right. And so how can we be more responsive to the needs of students? And one of my policy suggestions is for something called equity leave. So if you've been if a student has been exposed to racial, gender discrimination, which we do recognize under the law, can they take a timeout in their college journey to recover, to seek resources, to avoid the assailant that may be in their classes or in their social group? Can they take that time out, retain their credits, retain their standing, possibly retain their housing and access to meals, depending on the situation, and retain even their health insurance and counseling access, and then come back ready to start again with continuing resources and continuing strategies from that leave policy. We don't give the victim survivors that leave. Often, if someone does some wrongdoing, they are sent away and brought back. What if we did that for the people who actually experience the harm? And that's the idea around equity leave.
Jessica, your thoughts here as you're reimagining a more life-affirming higher education for survivors and victims.
Awesome. Thanks. I was going to ask you to repeat the question. So
Mhm.
thanks for doing it. Charles, I just feel like you're asking us to solve the problems of the world. I have many ideas. I don't know if they're all going to help or not. But the biggest thing, so from the research that I did, and the thing that continues to honestly kind of astound me, but also like lives in my soul as like understanding in my soul, is that I think one of the largest contributing factors to sexual violence on the college campus and in general in the US is the lack of sex education that individuals receive K through 12.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And I don't think I really knew I was going to find that, because I'm a product of that system of having the worst. I mean, I took health and sex ed online in high school, and I remember that I like forgot I had to do it, so I clicked through it in like a 2-day time span. And so the other thing, this goes back to your question about kind of intersectionality. The other thing is that for a lot of women of color, and I think people of color, it intersects with religion, it intersects with culture, that they're also not getting that education in the home, right? So it's either abstinence, I'm not going to tell you about it because you shouldn't be having sex, or it's simply like, we don't talk about that here. And so students, I think students in general, and then students of color in particular, are entering college with this very, very, a dearth of information around sexual violence, let alone sex, let alone consent, let alone sexual reproduction. And so we have them come in and we say, okay, again, here's the 15 minutes on consent, on sexual violence, where to go, what it is. Actually, we don't even cover what it is. So a lot of the women that I'm talking to, they don't report because they're like, oh, I actually had no idea it was sexual violence. And I still don't, think it's sexual violence, but somehow they do, because they're answering my call for research of, are you a survivor of sexual violence? And the other thing too is that there's several women who were in trainings later, right? So they become peer health educators, or they become, an orientation leader. And in those trainings, they have this realization of, whoa, not only am I a survivor of sexual violence because they just defined it for me, but I'm also a survivor of intergenerational trauma, because now I'm learning about that too. And so I really, I guess it's appropriate that I'm an educator and that I study education, but I really do think that a life-affirming institution is an educational system. So it's not just higher education, an educational system that centers and focuses on and educates us on sex, on healthy relationships, on bodily autonomy, on all of these really taboo subjects that honestly, like, I was about to say my age, and I think I'm at that age now where I can't say my age, but as an older woman, I can't believe I'm now learning this stuff, right? Like, because of these women who I'm like, oh my God, yeah, I don't know about that. So maybe I should go look into that. So I think that that's really specific to sexual violence, like life affirming for survivors. But I do think that that's the answer to racism and sexism and transphobia and religious oppression, is like, we're taught these very specific things, or lack thereof, within our educational lives. And then we're not getting it at home, because also our parents were taught that in the same educational system. And so, I mean, education, like, but a different type of education is what's going to be life affirming, right? The education that like educates us about life,
To briefly add on that, my own experience, I went to Catholic schools from K through graduate school. So I've never taken sex ed. I learned my sex ed education actually came through when I did 60 hours of training to be a rape victim advocate in Chicago. And so I think that's where most of my knowledge comes from, and has been sought out as a very late, as an adult. And to echo Jessica's comments, that race, religion, and gender play a huge role in the lack of sexual education preparation. Many of the participants that I talked to didn't have body autonomy in their own homes. So they were also survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And so that we don't, as higher educations, as an institution, we don't really reckon with the harm that a lot of students come in with, because age, being young, is a dimension of power that people who are older take advantage of, and that's across race. That's across race and gender, and so we don't really reckon with that as seriously as we should. But on the other side of it, higher education is kind of selling sex in a way. You come from in a traditional college age cohort, you come and you're free from your parents, you're living on your own, and you get to be around all these people of the same age and who are interesting and smart and attractive to you. And we are in part selling that experience to our students through the permissibility of the partying scene, through the land that is most central to the campus, maybe more central than even some academic buildings, for Greek life, for drinking, for partying, for sex. We are selling that, and we are not taking responsibility for our role in creating the conditions that produce sexual assault. So we also have to reckon with how we are participating in that and allowing it to happen for the sake of our budgets, for the sake of our sports teams, and for the sake of our school pride.
Yeah, thank you both for engaging in that exercise. It's not like an easy thing to try to do, right? In part is that, one, we don't spend a ton of time doing that, right? Definitely as researchers, we're always looking for the problems sort of component of it. And we don't often get the opportunity to just think through like what are new possibilities for us. And I think I'd only add, as we've been talking primarily about women, trans and non-binary folks, I can only think about also to the extent that there isn't this education on that side, there's even perhaps less education for men in a way that would create some sort of life-affirming set of circumstances, right? Both in terms of how our gender is constructed and socialized into us in these particular ways. And in some ways, how deeply personal it becomes for men who only see sort of like the humanity of women and other folks in their lives based on their proximity and their family, right? Which even then we can know is often trumped by power and how power moves, because those are usually the main people that are also perpetrating these things. But I also think about that re-envisioning and reimagining exercise that equips men before they've gotten to college to understand these things even more so, in hopes that they are less likely to perpetrate them. And I think to similar points that you all have made, and my work with young men and us talking about consent, talking about Title IX and sexual violence, it's interesting to see how many of the light bulbs go off as you're talking through these definitions, and how many of them immediately are like, oh, wow, there's something that I may have done that is directly being sort of like accounted for in this definition that maybe I didn't understand at the time would count as such. And that to me is alarming and concerning, right? And I even think about my own experience going to a very big party school, definitely like alcohol, football, sex is like the whole thing. And no one talked to me about consent. At no point during my membership intake process, in terms of becoming a member of a fraternity, did we seriously talk about these types of issues, right? Like maybe if you were in a GWS, course and we able to engage around gender. And thankfully at some point I was able to get it in this Africana Studies course that I took around Black masculinity, but it was like so far past the point, right? And so I could only think that if I hadn't been raised in the way that I was, that my father didn't teach me certain basic things that would later apply to like some of those scenarios and situations, that I myself would have been very much entrenched in perpetuating that, and to a certain extent, definitely complicit, right? Like there are things that we don't speak out on, or we're not trained to speak out because we're bystanders and allowing certain things to happen. So I think for me, just sort of adding into that, right, that reimagination must consider and put at the center to those who are primarily responsible for the perpetuation of sexual violence on campus. And we have to think really seriously about that, right, and how we do everything that we're doing. And so I know that we're right at time, but I just want to again thank you both, Kamaria, Jessica, for your time, for your energy, for your expertise, and all that you brought to this conversation. Again, I think it's really one of the most important ones that we have, and I hope that we'll continue it and find other opportunities to do this publicly. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a great holiday.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to the Police Free Campus podcast. I'd also like to thank the National Center for Institutional Diversity and the Anti-Racism Collaborative's Research Community Impact Fellowship, whose generous support made today's production possible. For more information about the Police Free Campus project, or to find resources about reimagining a world without police, visit our project website at policefreecampus.org. If you're interested to learn more about the work at the Campus Abolition Research Lab, consider joining our mailing list by visiting our website at campusabolition.org or following us on Twitter at Campus Abolition. We really, really, really appreciate y'all rocking with us, and we hope to continue to produce content that helps make new worlds possible. So be sure to tell your friends about us, and don't forget to share, like, and comment wherever you're listening to our podcast. Until next time, study, struggle, and peace.